My life was as ordinary as they come. Wake up at 7, grab a coffee on the way to the office, sift through endless reports, exchange half-hearted pleasantries with coworkers, have lunch at the same cafe, then ride the subway home. Routine wasn't exciting, but it was safe. Predictable. There's a certain comfort in blending into the background of your own life. No one stares too long. No one asks too many questions. You're just another face in the sea of millions. My face was like my life. Unremarkable. Average features, the kind that are easy to forget in a crowd. Not ugly, not beautiful, just there. And that was fine by me. In a city like this, being ordinary was a kind of armor. Who would bother noticing someone like me? But that evening, everything changed. It had been a late night at work. Some last-minute issue with a client had kept me stuck in the office. And by the time I left, the sky was ink black. The usual rush hour chaos had ebbed, leaving the subway unusually quiet. When I stepped onto the platform, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their flicker casting uneven shadows. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of silence that makes you second-guess every little sound. The subway car I boarded was nearly empty. A young couple sat whispering to each other in the far corner, their heads close enough to touch. A man in a tracksuit scrolled through his phone, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. And then there was him. He stood at the far end of the car, completely still, like a statue carved from the shadows. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of a long, dark coat. He wasn't tall, but there was something about the way he held himself, rigid, deliberate, as though he were trying to take up as little space as possible. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. Average height, short, dark hair, clean-shaven, forgettable. But his eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, cold as glass. They didn't dart away when I glanced up. He wasn't embarrassed to be caught staring. No, he wanted me to know he was watching. I've always been good at disappearing into myself. When someone's attention lingers too long, I shrink into the safety of my own mind, retreating behind a mask of indifference. But his gaze was relentless. It didn't feel curious or predatory. It felt clinical, like he was examining me, cataloging every detail. My pulse quickened, a tiny flutter of unease taking root in my chest. The subway car rattled on, each jolt making the fluorescent lights hum and flicker. I tried to distract myself, pulling out my phone and pretending to scroll through emails. But every time I glanced up, his eyes were still on me, unwavering, unrelenting. At the next stop, the doors hissed open, and the young couple got off, laughing softly as they disappeared into the station. The man in the tracksuit followed, leaving the car nearly empty. It was just me, him, and the oppressive hum of the subway lights. And then he moved. The man stepped forward, his polished shoes making barely a sound against the worn floor. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. My heart hammered against my ribs as he closed the distance between us. I wanted to get up, to move to another seat, to do something, but my body refused to obey. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the strap of my bag, so tightly my knuckles turned white. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jawline, the sharpness of his cheekbones. And then he leaned in, his face tilting toward mine. His voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sliced through the air like a knife. "You're a perfect specimen," he said. I blinked, stunned. The words didn't make sense. They felt wrong, intrusive, like they didn't belong in the mundane reality of a subway ride. Before I could respond, the train lurched to a stop. The door slid open, and he straightened, stepping back. But as he exited the car, he turned to look at me one last time. His lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a cold, surgical expression, as though he were satisfied with what he'd seen. The doors closed, and he was gone. I sat there, staring at the empty space where he'd stood, my mind racing. His voice echoed in my head, the words sticking to my thoughts like tar. "You're a perfect specimen." What the hell did that mean? Who was he? Why had he been watching me? By the time I got home, the unease had burrowed deep into my chest. I double-checked the locks on my door and closed the curtains, but it didn't help. His eyes, his smile, his words, they played on a loop in my mind, refusing to fade. That night, I dreamed of mirrors. Endless mirrors stretching out into infinity. In each one, my reflection stared back at me, but something was off. The face in the glass wasn't quite mine. The eyes were too small, the cheekbones too sharp, the skin too pale. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the reflection grinned, baring teeth that weren't mine. I woke up gasping, the sheets twisted around me like a cocoon. My skin was clammy with sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a stupid dream. But when I got up and looked in the bathroom mirror, the face staring back at me didn't feel like mine anymore. The morning light streamed through my curtains, painting the walls in pale gold. It should have felt comforting, but it didn't. The unease that had burrowed deep into my chest during the night had only grown. Something was wrong. I could feel it, like a splinter lodged in my mind, impossible to ignore. I forced myself out of bed, shuffling toward the bathroom. My body felt heavy, weighed down by a fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. The bathroom mirror greeted me with its usual stark honesty, and for a moment I hesitated. My hand hovered over the light switch, a small part of me afraid of what I might see. I flicked the switch, and the light buzzed to life. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. The changes were subtle, but undeniable. My eyes looked smaller, sunken deeper into my face. The curve of my nose was sharper, more angular. My cheekbones, once soft and rounded, now jutted out like blades. It was my face, but it wasn't. It felt like a poor imitation, as though someone had tried to recreate me from memory and failed. I touched my cheek, expecting the reflection to lag behind or distort. But it moved in perfect sync with me, its expression mirroring mine. The texture of my skin felt familiar under my fingertips, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. "It's just in your head," I whispered, gripping the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. "You didn't sleep well. That's all." But the reflection didn't blink, didn't falter. I threw on some clothes and hurried out of the apartment, desperate to escape the growing paranoia that clung to me like a second skin. The world outside was sharp, too vivid, like someone had turned the saturation up too high. Every sound grated against my nerves, the honk of car horns, the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of electricity in the streetlights. It all felt wrong, distorted, and the people, their gazes lingered on me a second too long. Not everyone, but enough to notice. A man waiting at a crosswalk glanced at me, his brow furrowing before he quickly turned away. A woman walking her dog looked me up and down, her lips pressing into a thin line. I told myself I was imagining it, but deep down I knew I wasn't. By the time I reached the cafe, my nerves were stretched thin. The familiar chime of the doorbell should have brought some comfort, but it didn't. The barista behind the counter wasn't Eric. Instead, it was a young woman I didn't recognize. She gave me a polite, almost rehearsed smile, but her eyes held a flicker of unease. "Morning," I said, forcing a smile. "Medium latte, please." "Sure thing," she replied, punching it into the register. Her hand hovered over the buttons for a moment before she glanced up at me. "Do you come here often?" The question hit me like a slap. "Every day," I said, the words sharper than I intended. "Where's Eric?" Her brow furrowed slightly, the polite smile faltering. "Eric? Sorry, I don't think I know him." I stared at her, my mind reeling. How could she not know Eric? He'd worked here for months, always greeting me with the same cheerful grin, always remembering my order. The barista handed me the latte, her hand brushing against mine for a brief moment. Her fingers were cold, and I pulled away quickly, mumbling a thank you as I turned and walked out the door. The streets felt colder now, the air heavier. I clutched the cup tightly, the warmth seeping into my hands as I tried to ground myself. But the unease wouldn't go away. And then I saw him. He was standing across the street, half hidden in the shadow of a building. His dark coat blended into the gloom, but I recognized him instantly. The man from the subway. He wasn't moving, wasn't blending into the crowd like everyone else. He was watching me, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. His head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me, calculating something. My heart hammered in my chest, and I tightened my grip on the coffee cup, the cardboard crumpling under my fingers. A bus passed between us, blocking my view for a split second. When it moved on, he was gone. I spun around, scanning the crowd, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. The coffee cup slipped from my hands, hitting the pavement and spilling its contents across the sidewalk. I didn't stop to pick it up. I didn't even care that people were staring now, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. All I could do was run. I didn't stop running until I was a block away, my chest heaving and my legs burning. The stares I'd felt moments ago seemed to linger in the back of my mind, ghostly impressions that refused to fade. I leaned against a lamppost, trying to steady my breathing. The world spun around me, but I wasn't sure if it was from the running or the sheer terror gripping me. It had been there. I hadn't imagined it. That man / you 2014, the man who had whispered those terrible words on the subway / you 2014 was following me, watching me. My stomach churned as I replayed the image of him standing across the street, his head tilted in that unnatural, calculating way. Forcing my legs to move again, I headed home, walking as quickly as I could without drawing more attention to myself. My eyes darted nervously to every shadow, every passerby, half expecting him to appear around the next corner. The journey felt endless, but I finally reached the sanctuary of my apartment. I bolted the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart still pounding. The silence inside felt oppressive, the stillness unnatural. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint sound from the street below, made me jump. I moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain, and peered outside. The street below looked as it always did, busy, noisy, alive. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place, that somewhere in the crowd, he was still watching me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Those cold, unblinking eyes, that slight smile that didn't reach his cheeks. And always, those words echoed in my mind. "You're a perfect specimen." The next day, I didn't bother going to the cafe. I didn't want to risk another encounter with people who didn't recognize me, who looked at me like I was a stranger. Instead, I wandered aimlessly through the city, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the man was just some random creep, and that my face hadn't changed. But the world wouldn't let me forget. At the corner of a busy intersection, a man selling newspapers called out to me. "Hey, miss," he said, his voice friendly but tinged with confusion. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" "No," I replied curtly, pulling my jacket tighter around me. But the question stayed with me. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at me like that, like they were trying to place a name to a face they thought they knew but couldn't quite remember. I kept walking, weaving through the crowds, my head down, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It pressed against my back, an almost physical weight that made my skin crawl. When I finally dared to glance over my shoulder, I saw him again. The man from the subway. This time, he wasn't standing still. He was walking behind me, his pace matching mine, always keeping the same distance between us. My heart thundered in my chest, my mind racing. He's following me. He's following me. I turned down a side street, quickening my pace. The sound of his footsteps behind me was faint but unmistakable. The street was quieter here, the crowds thinning out. My thoughts spiraled as I scanned my surroundings for a way to escape. A narrow alley caught my eye. Without thinking, I darted into it, hoping to lose him in the maze of back streets. The alley was dark and smelled faintly of garbage, but I kept moving, the sound of my shoes echoing off the brick walls. When I reached the other end, I paused, pressing myself against the wall and listening. The sound of footsteps had stopped. For a moment, I thought I had lost him. Then a voice broke the silence. "You can't run forever." I spun around, my back pressed against the cold brick. He was there, standing at the entrance to the alley, his silhouette sharp against the faint glow of a street lamp. His voice was calm, almost amused. "You think you can hide from me?" he said, taking a step closer. "You were meant to be found. Panic surged through me, and I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. My feet pounded against the pavement as I ran deeper into the labyrinth of alleys, the walls closing in around me. Eventually, I stumbled out onto a quiet street, my lungs burning and my legs trembling. The man was nowhere to be seen, but his words lingered in the air like smoke. Back in my apartment, I paced the floor, my thoughts racing. Who was he? Why was he following me? And what did he mean by meant to be found? My mind was a tangle of fear and confusion, but one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore this any longer. I had to do something. I spent hours searching online, typing variations of man following me, changes in appearance, and unrecognizable face into every search engine I could think of. Most of the results were useless, a mix of paranoid forum posts and unrelated articles. But then, buried in the depths of a conspiracy website, I found something. A thread titled The Collector. The posts were fragmented, written by people who claimed they had been followed by a man who seemed to take an unnatural interest in their faces. They described dreams of mirrors, of their reflections smiling when they shouldn't, of strangers not recognizing them. And in every case, the man disappeared before they could confront him. But one post stood out. It was from someone who claimed to have escaped. If he's watching you, the post read, he's already marked you. He's not just taking your face. He's taking your identity. Don't trust what you see in the mirror. It's not you anymore. The only way to stop him is to confront him. Destroy the source. You'll know it when you see it. My blood ran cold as I read the words. Was this what was happening to me? Was he trying to take more than just my face? I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. Confronting him was the last thing I wanted to do. But if I didn't, a noise from the kitchen made me jump. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. On the counter, where there had been nothing before, lay a slip of paper. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding. The paper was blank except for a set of coordinates scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. I didn't need to type them into my phone to know what they were. He was leading me to him. The coordinates led to the outskirts of the city, a part of town that had long been abandoned. Industrial ruins lined the streets, their rusted frames jutting into the gray sky like the skeletons of giants. Weeds choked the cracked pavement, swaying in the biting wind, and the air was thick with the smell of damp metal and decay. My car's engine sputtered as I pulled up to the location on the map. Before me stood a warehouse, its massive, corrugated steel walls weathered by time and graffiti. One of the windows near the roof was shattered, a jagged hole revealing only darkness inside. The building loomed like a monument to something long forgotten, something that should have been left buried. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the structure. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave and never look back. But I couldn't. If I left now, this nightmare would never end. I grabbed my phone and typed a quick message to myself. Warehouse, 42nd Street. If I don't come back, start here. It felt absurd, like a bad cliche from a movie, but it gave me a strange sense of comfort. The air was heavy as I stepped out of the car, the wind biting through my jacket. My boots crunched against the gravel as I approached the warehouse, each step feeling like a march toward my own execution. The massive steel door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within. I hesitated, my breath fogging in the cold air. Then, summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I pushed the door open. It groaned loudly, the sound echoing through the cavernous space inside. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I took a cautious step inside, the dim light from the doorway casting long shadows across the floor. The walls were the first thing I noticed. They were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, pinned haphazardly in clusters. Faces stared back at me from every direction, their expressions frozen in eerie calm. The sheer number of them was overwhelming, their eyes following me as I moved deeper into the room. And then I saw it. At the center of the largest cluster was my face. It was the face I remembered, the one I had grown up with, the one I had seen in the mirror every day of my life. My real face. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled forward, drawn to the image like a moth to a flame. I reached out to touch it, but my fingers froze an inch away. The surface shimmered faintly, almost as if the photograph were alive. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. He was there, standing in the shadows at the far end of the room. The man from the subway. He stepped forward, the dim light catching the sharp angles of his face. His movements were smooth, almost unnaturally so, like a predator closing in on its prey. "You came," he said, his lips curling into that cold, familiar smile. "I knew you would." "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" He tilted his head, studying me with those piercing, unblinking eyes. "You already know the answer," he said. "You're a masterpiece, Eva. But even masterpieces can be refined." "Refined?" My voice cracked, anger rising to the surface. "You think this is art? You think you can just steal people's lives and call it perfection?" His smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew wider. Perfection is never stolen. It's created, and every face, every piece brings me closer to the ultimate design. I took a step back, my hands balling into fists. My gaze darted to the wall of photographs, to the image of my face. If he drew power from them, if they were the source of whatever hold he had over me, then destroying them might be my only chance. "What happens now?" I asked, stalling for time. He chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Now, you join the collection." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, ornate knife. The blade glinted in the dim light, its edge impossibly sharp. Panic surged through me, but my mind was already racing. I had to act quickly. As he stepped closer, I lunged toward the wall, grabbing the photograph of my face. The moment my fingers touched it, the air around us seemed to crackle with energy. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. I didn't answer. I tore the photograph from the wall and hurled it to the ground, stomping on it with all my strength. The effect was immediate. The entire warehouse shuddered, the walls trembling as a deafening roar filled the air. The other photographs began to ripple and distort, their once still faces shifting in agony. "No," he screamed, his voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. "You don't understand what you're doing." But I didn't stop. I grabbed another photograph, then another, tearing through them with a ferocity I didn't know I possessed. Each one sent a shockwave through the room, the air growing heavier with every rip. The man staggered back, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You think this will save you?" he spat, his voice a mixture of fury and desperation. "You think destroying these will make you whole again?" I didn't answer. My focus was on the photographs, on destroying every last one of them. The room grew brighter and brighter, the light almost blinding, until finally, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the cold, dusty floor. The walls were bare, the photographs gone. The man was nowhere to be seen. I pulled myself to my feet, my body trembling. My gaze fell on a shard of broken glass lying nearby, its surface reflecting the faint glow of the overhead light. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and looked at my reflection. It was me, my face, my real face. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I stumbled out of the warehouse into the cool night air. The stars above seemed brighter, the world sharper. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. But as I walked away, one thought lingered in the back of my mind. Had I truly escaped? I didn't look back at the warehouse. The building loomed behind me like a specter, its presence heavy in the cool night air. Every step I took away from it felt surreal, like I was walking out of a dream that had tangled itself into my reality. But even as the stars above seemed brighter, as the air felt sharper against my skin, I couldn't shake the thought. Was it really over? The ride back to my apartment was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles pale as I navigated the quiet streets. The city looked unchanged, its indifferent glow spilling across empty sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. Yet something felt different. The tension that had clung to me for days was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow stillness. When I reached my building, I hesitated at the door. My reflection in the glass caught my eye. It was mine, fully mine. But even now, I couldn't help but search for imperfections, for signs that it wasn't truly me. My fingers brushed against my cheek, and I let out a shuddering breath. Inside my apartment, the silence was deafening. I locked the door behind me, bolting it twice, and leaned against it. My chest heaved as the adrenaline of the night finally ebbed, leaving me drained. The apartment felt the same. Every detail untouched. You 2014, the rumpled blanket on the couch, the half-empty mug on the counter. It was as if the world had paused while I had been dragged into something beyond comprehension. I made my way to the bathroom, my legs trembling beneath me. The mirror felt like a test, a final hurdle I had to face. I turned on the light, bracing myself. The face staring back at me was my own. The eyes were the right size, the cheekbones rounded, the nose familiar. I smiled tentatively, and the reflection smiled back perfectly in sync. Relief washed over me like a tide, my body sagging as the weight of everything lifted just a little. But as I stared into the mirror, a thought gnawed at the edges of my mind. I had destroyed the photographs, torn down the wall of faces. I had seen him falter, seen him disappear. Yet a question remained. Where had he come from? And where had he gone? The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. The world seemed to accept me again. Eric was back at the cafe, greeting me with his usual cheery grin. My co-workers no longer looked at me like a stranger, their interactions slipping back into the casual familiarity of office banter. Everything was normal, but normal felt wrong. At night, I still dreamed of mirrors. Not the endless corridors of reflections that had haunted me before, but something worse. In the dreams, my reflection was mine, but not quite. It watched me too closely, its movements slightly delayed, its eyes too knowing. Sometimes it smiled when I didn't. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my mind processing the trauma of what had happened. But the unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. And then one evening, I found something. It was late, the apartment quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I had been sifting through the pile of mail on my counter, tossing aside bills and advertisements, when I noticed an envelope I didn't recognize. It was plain, unmarked, with no return address. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was me, or rather, it was the face I had seen in the mirror every day before this nightmare began. My real face, the one I thought I had reclaimed. Written on the back, in the same precise handwriting as the coordinates, was a single line. Perfection is eternal. I stared at the photograph, my breath catching in my throat. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing down on me. My vision blurred as a wave of nausea rolled over me. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the mirror. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The bathroom door was open, the mirror visible from where I stood. At first, it looked normal, but as I stepped closer, I saw it. The reflection was smiling, but I wasn't. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.